So welcome to the last video of the last reproductive physiology lesson in the sexuality and reproduction block. We're going to talk about some of the hormones that we've already sort of been talking about anyway in the previous videos in a little bit more detail, and then we're going to talk about the process of parturition, which is pretty interesting, and then the process of lactation, which is also interesting, each one kind of unique in its own way. So let's start with HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, required in early pregnancy, as I said before, from the syncytio trophoblast cells, as I said before, early in the placenta, late, okay. These are the cells that are associated with the blastocyst as it's putting out these extensions, and then it's part of the placenta. They eventually become part of the placenta. And again, as I mentioned in a previous video, the reason why this works is because the structure is very similar to LH. And so its effect on the corpus luteum is very similar to LH. So as long as you have this LH substance binding to receptors on the corpus luteum and stimulating the production of progesterone, the corpus luteum will hang around. And it will hang around until the placenta is producing enough progesterone on its own, and then it'll disappear when this disappears. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about progesterone. There it is right there, made by the placenta. Okay? It maintains the endometrial layer. Okay? So nice and thick. The way that it is at the end of the menstrual cycle, instead of bleeding and getting rid of all that, the progesterone sticks around and maintains that layer. So you've got a nice soft cushion for implantation to take place. Nice soft vascular cushion. It reduces muscular contractility of the uterus, so you're not going to be ejecting this uterus early. You're going to keep it nice and happy and implanted in the uterine wall. It maintains a firm cervix to keep that fetus in the uterus and not allow it to slip out. It increases the maternal appetite and fat deposition, basically so that the fetus can get enough energy and nutrients, and stimulates respiration. It actually helps with respiratory development. It seems to have an effect on the respiratory centers in the brain, so that you're ready to go when the fetus hits the outside world and needs those lungs to keep itself oxygenated. Okay? So basically, in a nutshell, progesterone's there to maintain that fetus and keep it happy. Keep it getting nutrients, keep it vascular, keep it from being ejected, sitting nice and comfortable in this nice little womb that we all imagine was such a nice place. Okay? Now we talk about estrogen's role in all this, and that's a little bit different. It also produced by the placenta. So the concentrations of both of these are going up more and more. They're gradually going up as development takes place and as the fetus gets bigger and bigger. Okay, so you're getting more and more of both of these. They're both increasing, and some of these effects appear to be, and really are, in contrast to what progesterone is doing. So progesterone reduces contraction of the uterine muscle. Estradiol increases contractility of that muscular layer, so that when it isn't stimulated, you're actually getting stronger contractions. It increases gap junctions to coordinate those contractions. It increases blood flow, and it increases the size of the muscular layer. Okay? So basically what it's doing is it's priming the uterus to get ready for the process of parturition, because at that point you need nice strong contractions and you need nice strong muscle. The estrogen plays a role in getting the uterine wall ready to do that. And so because of that, what you've got here is a balance. You've got the placenta producing progesterone, which says let's not contract, let's keep this fetus nice and happy in its womb. And you've got the estradiol, which is like, hey man, we're going to have to get rid of this thing, and the muscle's going to have to be ready to go. So these two sort of oppose one another, and the balance between the two sort of determines, as we're going to see in a moment, when parturition takes place, or when you're ready for parturition to take place. Okay. And now let's talk a little about cortisol, which is also very much involved in the process of parturition. What we're going to find out in a minute is that cortisol is involved in the timing for delivery through what's called, through its participation in what's called the CRH clock, which I'll talk about in a moment. It is involved in pulmonary development as well, as we'll see in a moment, and you do need it around for this fetus to have nice functional lungs. It stimulates the production of surfactant, which we all know very important if you want this thing to breathe. And it is involved in the closure of the ductus arteriosus, so you don't get a PDA. Created in the fetus from the placental progesterone. So the progesterone makes its way to the fetus, and you get cortisol production right there. Okay? So having said all that, we talked about some of the hormones that are involved in parturition. Let's talk about the process. Some key questions. First of all, what determines when the fetus is ready, and how is that signal? Well, it's not completely known. I'm about to take you through the process of the CRH clock and pretend that it is completely known, but it's not. What is definitely known is that you need a developed HP axis, so hypothalamic pituitary axis. They have to be developed and secreting hormones so that the fetus has to be able to produce cortisol, and it has to be able to produce ACTH. In order for that to happen, you have to have this functioning hypothalamus and pituitary. So it's known that at bare minimum that these are absolute facts. The timing is definitely involved in this. Okay? How and when is the uterine myometrium converted from a quiescent state to a contractile state? As I said a minute ago, probably involves the interplay between estrogen, which is saying let's get this puppy ready to go and out by stimulating the uterine wall, and progesterone, which is saying let's keep it nice and happy where it is, and let's not inject it. So these two sort of compete, and it's that interplay that really probably determines when you go from, okay, let's keep the fetus happy, to okay, ready or not, there it goes. Okay? Some facts about parturition before we talk about the theory behind the process. It requires relaxation of the cervix, what we would call a softening of the cervix. Really what it is it's an increase in the compliance of the structure so that at the same pressure you have more volume. It's easier to increase the volume. It's easier for the fetus to expand it and get out. And it requires coordinated contraction of the uterus to push the fetus through the birth canal, out through the cervix and the vagina. The muscle involved is non-striated, smooth muscle, which is linked by gap junctions. And it is a functional syncytium, somewhat like the cardiac muscle is, where all the cardiac cells are connected through gap junctions and sort of act as one sort of, in a way, big cell. This is true of the uterine contractions as well, through these gap junctions, and as you'll recall, estrogen increases those gap junctions. So the uterine contractions depend on extracellular calcium. Calcium usually involved in muscular contraction. Not a great surprise there. Prostaglandins increase intracellular calcium, and so they are going to increase uterine contractions and be involved in parturition. Oxytocin, also involved in parturition, also acts by increasing calcium influx and lowering the excitation threshold of the muscles that's contracting more. You are getting hypertrophy of those muscle cells roughly 10 times. So during pregnancy to get them ready to contract in a nice, powerful manner. So as I mentioned, the cervix keeps that fetus in and happy. Prostaglandins, E and F, increase the compliance of the cervix, so they are responsible for this required softening that takes place. These two prostaglandins are synthesized by the endometrium, myometrium, cervix, and placenta. So they are pretty important, and they're generated all over the place, and they are released by estrogen, as we're going to find out in a moment, that makes them involved in parturition. And it does oppose the effect of progesterone on the cervix, which is basically keeping that cervix hardened and stiff, as I mentioned earlier in the lesson. So having said all of that, let's talk about the theory behind how all this stuff works. First of all, CRH is corticotropin releasing hormone. That is central to this process. This whole process is called the CRH clock. So let's start with high estradiol. This is produced by the placenta. It's building as pregnancy goes on. Estradiol causes an increase in prostaglandins, as I said earlier, and that actually increases production of CRH. And the CRH can be free, or it can be bound to the CRHBP, or corticotropin releasing hormone binding protein. Okay? So the free CRH can go across and find its way to the fetal pituitary gland from the placenta, and it stimulates the fetal pituitary gland to increase ACH. So I said earlier, ACH essential to this process. Fetus has to be able to produce it. ACTH stimulates the adrenal gland to release cortisol, and that also essential for this process. And that contributes to the maturation of the fetus. So we have lung maturation, so the little thing can breathe when it gets out. The liver glycogen levels go up, gluconeogenesis goes up, increased intestinal transport and digestion. Closure of the ductus arteriosus, so we don't get a PDA, or at least if there's no cortisol, you will get a PDA. Okay. We also have production of DHEA. This acts as a precursor in the placenta for the production of estradiol. And again, estradiol has all these effects of the uterine myometrium, increasing the actin, myosin gap junctions. You're getting hypertrophy. You're getting an increase in oxytocin receptors, which are going to be essential. They're going to play their role in parturition here. Okay, so estrogen acting to on the maternal side to get the uterus ready to eject this thing into the real world. And you'll notice that we have high cortisol here due to the stimulation of the fetal pituitary, fetal adrenal. That's increasing CRH. We have higher estradiol. That's increasing CRH. Increasing CRH is increasing cortisol and estradiol, which is increasing CRH, which is increasing cortisol and estradiol with positive feedback loop. And as the fetus matures and the pregnancy moves on, the estradiol and the cortisol, they build and build, and the CRH builds and builds. And at the same time, the CRH binding protein's going down. So you're having less and less of this bound and more of it free, and that's causing more and more cortisol, more and more estradiol. Eventually, we get to the point where the whole thing, poof, explodes. And you've hit a critical CRH and estradiol concentration. And once you hit that concentration, the uterine contractions become strong enough, and you begin the process of parturition and ejecting that fetus. So this is called the CRH clock. Okay, the gradual increase of CRH and estradiol taking place round and around as we go, as the fetus matures and everything grows and the pregnancy progresses. Okay, so we have an increased estrogen that's building up our myometrium, increasing gap junctions, it's increasing oxytocin receptors. We're getting more contraction of the uterus, right? Eventually, what happens is the fetus starts to get pushed up against the cervix, and it stimulates the cervix. And at that point, you get a neuroendocrine reflex that kicks in, and that increases oxytocin. The oxytocin feeds back, increases calcium influx, decreases the threshold for contraction. You get more contraction in the uterus. We get increased prostaglandins here. That feeds back. That increases calcium. That increases contraction. You increase contraction. You shove the fetus against the cervix. You further stimulate the cervix. You further increase oxytocin. We have positive feedback loop going on here. Parturition initiates and takes place as the cervix is stimulated and the oxytocin is released and the prostaglandins go up. Okay? You may wonder, when does this stop? It basically stops when the cervix stops being stimulated. When you push that fetus out and it's no longer pushing against the cervix, that stops the neuroendocrine reflex and delivery has happened. Okay? And, all right. So having said that, the newborn is delivered and it has to get nutrients, and of course we need to talk about the process of lactation and how this organ works, the mammary gland. So at birth, the mammary gland really has almost no alveoli. The alveoli are down here, they produce the milk. Okay? At puberty, the increase in estrogen and progesterone that you get lead to the appearance of these alveoli. The breasts grow and develop. And as every father of every newborn knows, you get hypertrophy of this gland during pregnancy, getting ready to secrete more milk. Okay? If we take a closer look at the alveoli, the myoepithelial layer, we have two layers. We have a myoepithelial layer around the outside. It is stimulated by oxytocin. It causes this layer to contract, and you literally squeeze and eject milk out of the mammary gland through the contraction of this layer. A lot of people think, or they get the impression, that a newborn is sucking out the milk. That is not true. The milk is actually being ejected in response to the suckling stimuli, and it's being ejected by this oxytocin reaction on the myoepithelial layer. The alveolar epithelial cell layer, that makes the milk, okay? And it makes it with stimulation by prolactin. So prolactin required to produce milk, oxytocin required to deliver the milk. So if you're getting production but no delivery, maybe you think oxytocin. If you're getting no production, then maybe you think maybe prolactin or something. The two are separable, and they're both required for the fetus to get the milk. All right. So a little bit about the suckling reflex. First of all, the reflex requires the disappearance of estrogen and progesterone from the maternal circulation, and that occurs within 1 week of birth. Prolactin increases throughout pregnancy, not through the suckling, of course, but just gradually, and it remains elevated throughout lactation, of course. If there's no suckling after birth, the milk secretion will be scant. It'll continue for about a month because of the elevated prolactin level from the pregnancy. When suckling does occur, there are bursts of prolactin secretion, and that's what's actually happening here in this reflex. So let's start a little bit about the reflex itself. First of all, we have our hypothalamus, our hypothalamic pituitary interaction to cause the secretion of prolactin, PRL. Note that this is different from the previous situations where we've talked about the interaction of the hypothalamus with the anterior pituitary. In previous situations, we've talked about hormones that are secreted by the hypothalamus, and they stimulate the pituitary to secrete things like LH and FSH. You'll talk about growth hormone, things like that, okay? In this case, dopamine secretion is preventing the release and the secretion of prolactin. And what that means is that if I were to damage the hypothalamus, or more likely this neck here, between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, such that the hypothalamic hormones couldn't get to the anterior pituitary, these LH, the FSH, things like that, those things are going to drop because there's no stimulus here for secretion. In contrast to that, if you damage this area and the dopamine can't get through, the prolactin secretion is going to go up and you'll actually have high prolactin. It acts exactly the opposite. The prolactin, the dopamine inhibition will be relieved. If there's no dopamine, then you'll get a high prolactin in that case. So it's a different situation. It's a different paradigm from what we've talked about earlier when we've talked about this axis. So the whole thing begins with the newborn suckling and the stimulus. This is a neuroendocrine reflex, and the stimulus acts upon the hypothalamus to decrease dopamine secretion. That decreased dopamine secretion relieves the inhibition on the anterior pituitary, and there is an increase in prolactin secretion as a result of that. So this is, again, it's odd. It's not the same as what we've talked about earlier. It's come up before with this figure, should this line be blue or red? Red means stimulate, blue means inhibit. And it's kind of confusing because you're stimulating the release of prolactin with the suckling, but you're inhibiting the release of dopamine with the suckling. So it's this decrease that causes this increase. So you can argue either way. It could be blue, could be red. It's red on the figure. Either way, don't worry about whether it's a negative feedback loop or a positive feedback loop. Just know suckling leads to decreased dopamine, which leads to increased prolactin. You'll be fine. We won't worry about technicalities and terminology. Okay? So don't let this bother you. Just, take it the way it is. Estrogen increases prolactin stores. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, that's this TRH, that actually causes prolactin secretion from the anterior pituitary. Role in all of this sort of unknown. And there is some evidence for a prolactin releasing peptide, or PRP here. That is here. Again, role in all of this really unknown. So, even when you look in your textbook, the Byrne and Levy book, these are just sort of like mentioned. But a big deal is not made out of them, and frankly, the only reason I'm mentioning them here is because they're on this they're on this figure, and so I didn't want you wondering what the heck is TRH, what the heck is PRH. Do I need to know it? The answer is that's what these are, and no, you don't need to know it. Okay, worry about dopamine. Dopamine is the major effector here, and as far as we are concerned, it is the one that the decrease in dopamine is what causes that increase in prolactin. Don't worry about these other two. I just mentioned them because they're there. All right. So let's talk about the suckling stimulus a little bit more. We just went through this branch where the suckling stimulus leads to a decreased dopamine and increased prolactin from the anterior pituitary. That causes milk production. We have an increased synthesis of oxytocin in response to this stimulus. That causes an increased release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. That also stimulates the breast, in this case, to eject milk. And we also have this effect in the middle where we actually decrease GnRH, and that decreases LH secretion, and that inhibits ovulation. Okay. And prolactin also acts on the ovary to inhibit ovulation, presumably to decrease the chances that you'll get pregnant again and use energy to maintain a pregnancy while you're trying to breastfeed a newborn at the same time. The question comes up, is this a form of contraception that you can rely on? My understanding is the answer to that is no. It is not reliable. These increases in prolactin, for instance, are in bursts and stuff like that, and it's going up and down. And you can't really rely on this inhibition to prevent a pregnancy. It just makes it much more unlikely. Okay? For what it's worth, that's my understanding. It's not a good form of contraception. All right? And so, again, we have prolactin maintaining milk production, we have oxytocin causing the ejection of milk. Both are essential for the newborn to get its milk and its nutrition, okay? So they both need to be there, and if one or the other is missing, you are not going to get that milk delivered, okay? All right, that's the end of this lesson. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you guys in the rooms.